So these are some of the largest earthquakes in American history, occurring within about 10 hours of one another in a very, very remote part of the United States.
From the river to the valley to the sea. All the places, all the people that you can meet.
Welcome to the Mississippi Valley Traveler Podcast. I'm Dean Klinkenberg, and I've been exploring the deep history and rich culture of the people and places along America's greatest river, the Mississippi, since 2007. Join me as I go deep into the characters and places along the river and occasionally wander into other stories from the Midwest and other rivers. Read the episode show notes and get more information on the Mississippi at MississippiValleyTraveler.com. Let's get going. Welcome to episode 11 of the Mississippi Valley Traveler Podcast. On the morning of December 16th, 1811, a major earthquake rattled the ground of New Madrid, Missouri, and the surrounding area. George Christ wrote about that morning, "You could not hold on to nothing. Neither man or woman was strong enough. The shaking would knock you loose like knocking hickory nuts out of a tree. None of us was killed. We was all banged up and some of us knocked out for a while, and blood was everywhere. Everybody is scared to death." That quake was the first of many that would shake the area around New Madrid, and the quakes were strong enough to be felt over almost half of the country. In this episode, I talked with Jeff Grunwald, who's the administrator of the New Madrid Historical Museum, about those quakes in 1811 and 1812. We talk about the impact they had on the area, who was affected, how they affected the Mississippi River, and a lot more. It's a really engaging discussion. Well, I apologize a little bit in advance. The audio for my portion is a little is not great, is not ideal. So fortunately, he's doing most of the talking, so it should be fine. A quick shout out to all the Patreon supporters, but especially to those who are new supporters or who have recently increased their pledge, including Peggy Naiman and Michael Anderson. Thank you so much. Now let's get on to the interview. Most of us probably don't realize that some of the largest earthquakes in American history did not happen in California, but rather in the middle of the country. And I'm so excited today to be here with Jeff Grunwald, the administrator of the New Madrid Historical Museum, to talk about these amazing series of earthquakes that happened in the early 1800s in Middle America and the impact they had on the people who were trying to eke out a living in what was, let's call it the wilderness or the undeveloped part of the country. Jeff, thank you so much for being here and talking with me today.
Dean, I am happy to be here and appreciate you inviting me. So yeah, happy to talk earthquakes.
So let's do a couple of things right out of the bat. Like I know when people see the name of the town, they probably assume it's pronounced like people say it in Spain, but actually we're talking about New Madrid, correct?
New Madrid, yes. New Madrid, Missouri, yes. Spelled like Madrid, pronounced funny though. So,
right.
The southern tip of Illinois isn't too far from here, and they've got a town that looks an awful like it should be called Cairo. They call it Cairo. South of us, there's a Haiti that we call Haiti, and then a little bit further down the road, there's a Blytheville that's Blabble. So,
Right. And there's another town in southwest Missouri named after the French palace that we call Versailles.
Yes, one in Kentucky as well that likes Versailles.
So when you're in the Midwest, it's a good idea to ask how things are pronounced because you just never know.
No, you don't. No, you don't. Des Plaines, Illinois drives my folks in Des Moines, Iowa. Great. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well,
we can do a separate podcast on local names and how they pronounce.
I think that's a great idea. Maybe that's a whole nother segment sometime. Well, let's set the stage for this a little bit. So the earthquakes that happened in 1811, 1812, tell us a little bit about what the communities were like in New Madrid. I think Little Prairie was another town nearby. What were those communities like before the earthquakes hit?
Well, New Madrid had been founded in the 1780s. Originally, there was a French trading post there. It was called Lannes Alegres. which is Cove of Grease or Cove of Fat, named that because there was a large amount of bear grease that was being harvested from the area. There was a lot of wildlife. The town actually ended up being founded by a gentleman named George Morgan out of Philadelphia. Under the aegis of Spain, he struck a deal with the Spanish ambassador in Spain, whose name was Diego de Gardoqui, actually. And he was going to bring American settlers over and found a Spanish town just south of the mouth of the Ohio River. He brought 70 people with him. They sailed down the Ohio River and formed the town in 1789 as New Madrid, Nuevo Madrid. This was to earn, I guess, some points with the Spanish governor, who he was going to meet in New Orleans. He met a gentleman. His name was Don Esteban Miro. And Moreau had different ideas about New Madrid than de Gardoqui did, and Morgan did as well. And so Morgan thought he was going to be the commandant of the town and was going to profit from land sales, very reasonable land sales, but he would profit from those. But Spain were currently giving away land for free, so they didn't really like Morgan's idea of selling land. And if he wasn't going to be able to sell land, there was going to be no money in it for him. And he was really a land speculator. And then he found out he wasn't going to be the commandant. He was going to be second in command. So he just took his ball and went home. He went back to Philadelphia directly from New Orleans, never returning again to the town which he founded. Only 14 of the original 70 people actually ended up staying in New Madrid. But Morgan was advertising this wonderful town that he was founding in broadsheets and newspapers all across the East Coast. And so even though he went home, people came, and you had several hundred there. By the early 1790s, the first school was actually started in 1793. And I think there was, if I'm not mistaken, about 700 people there by the mid 1790s, actually. So New Madrid grew relatively quickly. It's built on bluffs, high bluffs above the river, at a big bend in the river. So it was an ideal place to found a town. Unfortunately, those bluffs started being eroded almost immediately upon settlement of the town, and New Madrid was losing about 100 yards a year to the Mississippi River. So there was the Spanish built a fort there, Fort Celeste. There's maps that show it in 1795, I believe. By 1800, it had fell in the river and it had to be abandoned. So New Madrid was fighting nature from the beginning, but they were surrounded by very, very good farmland and ample supply of wildlife from which they could harvest pelts and also get protein and food. And then the river was a good source of food as well. So New Madrid was moving forward, even though they were fighting nature at the same time. I believe the population of New Madrid County, which is much larger than the New Madrid County we know today, it even included some of extreme northeast Arkansas, but was at about 3,000 in 1810. 3165
Wow.
was the population as in 1810. So you could say it was flourishing.
Yeah, it was kind of a boom town there, and I think people sometimes forget there was a 40-year period of time when the Spanish controlled the Louisiana territory. After France lost the war to England, they ended up selling the land to Spain, who managed the Louisiana territory for about 40 years. So when New Madrid was founded, it was under the Spanish government, as you said.
That's exactly right. Yes.
Which is why it's New Madrid instead of New Paris.
Right. It originally settled by the French, and then after the French and Indian War, the Spanish were given control. And so New Spain was what they were going to call this area in North America, actually. The Louisiana Purchase changed all of that. France took control of what would become Louisiana or New Spain in 1801, and then sold that to the U.S. to help fund some of Napoleon's exploits in Europe. And in 1803, it became a part of the United States.
Mm-hmm. So around the time that New Bad was founded, too, I think there was a community of Shawnee Indians who lived in the area. Is that right?
That is right. I believe Delaware Shawnee and some Kaskaskia Indians were in the area. Most of them had moved actually from the east, so they were not native to the area, but had come throughout the 18th century into Missouri.
And they had some interaction then with the people who were moving into the community of New Madrid. As I understand it, there was a fair amount of trade and interaction among folks.
Yes, absolutely. And Morgan really had an idyllic, almost utopian sort of view of the town he wanted to found. Green spaces, freedom of religion, respecting the Native American tribes and their place in the area, in what would become Missouri. And you had a lot of trade going on at the time between the Native Americans and Europe and the American settlers that were moving there. So you did hear a lot of fighting between those two groups at the time. Mm-hmm. So yes, that's correct.
And I think, if I remember right, there were some enslaved Africans too that were part of that population.
Yes, it was a small number, but there were slaves, and Missouri would become a slave state. After the Missouri Compromise, right, as Missouri was admitted to the Union in 1821, after the Missouri Compromise as a slave state, even though it was north of the original boundary of free versus slave states, mm-hmm. Which was, I believe, 4340 in terms of the 3430. I'm sorry, 3430 latitude.
So there had to be a lot of optimism in this town. Like, there were hundreds of people who were moving there. The land was good for farming. There was relatively peaceful. People had to be feeling good about their prospects, and there just had to be a general optimism about the future.
I would say yes. They were, again, fighting nature, right? The river's taking part of their town every year. Floods were a problem, so it wasn't idyllic, but it was probably about as good as you were going to get out on the western frontier of the United States in the first decade of the 19th mm-hmm. century. So yeah, I would say things were going pretty well.
So tell us what happened with the first earthquake then.
Okay, so December 16th, 1811, and this came on the tail of a comet. Actually, there was a comet that had showed its head, I guess, in the sky in the fall of 1811. Comets tended to be taken as bad omens, right, by people. And you also had the sort of the war clouds were kind of forming as well. The U.S. and Britain would fight again in 1812. So not all was ideal. But on the morning of December 16th, 1811, around 2 a.m., the world exploded, I guess, is the way I like to describe it. A violent earthquake that struck in what's now, they think, northeast Arkansas was the epicenter of the first one. And it was a violent quake, upended the river, the land. You had the land sunk. It was really, really a violent and overpowering natural disaster that the people were faced with in the middle of the night. That would be followed by two more shocks that day, one later in the morning and one at about noon. These were almost as powerful. These days, what you'll see in terms of magnitude estimates are mid to high 7 magnitude range for that first one, about 7 for the other two. So these are some of the largest earthquakes in American history, occurring within about 10 hours of one another in a very, very remote part of the United States. Little Prairie, you mentioned, which was now Caruthersville. The town of Caruthersville, Missouri, is where Little Prairie once was. It was basically erased by those earthquakes that day. Little Prairie, mostly by flooding from the river, it was virtually wiped out. The residents of Little Prairie would instantly become refugees, is what I kind of like to think of it. They were homeless. and didn't know what to do. And most of them, after a couple of days, decided to head north. And so Little Prairie would be consigned to history. The Little Prairie residents would actually head north to New Madrid, and they would arrive on Christmas Eve, actually. About 100 of them. So it was a pretty big group. The folks in New Madrid at this time, a lot of them had already decided that sleeping in their homes was not a great idea. So they had moved into encampments around the town, 50 to 100 persons each, and they were living and sleeping outside, and they made room for these folks from Little Prairie. And that was the December 16th quake. So
can you imagine the journey? Little Prairie to New Madrid at that time. How far a distance are we talking?
About, I would say 45, about 40 miles, something along those lines.
And it had to be.
So it was a long hike. It took several days. They encountered cracks and fissures. Some reports were that they felled trees, so they chopped trees down and put those over the fissures so that they could cross them and keep heading north. Some of the details are pretty foggy. You get and so a lot of the firsthand accounts sort of combine dates and events and things. I think because everything was so just so unclear, I think folks probably had a lot of these events kind of moshed up in their minds, and they all kind of got glommed together. So,
right.
But the flight from Little Prairie to New Madrid was a very desperate trip for those folks.
Yeah, I can't imagine what that experience would be like. Like you just lost your home to some, I guess they kind of understood what earthquakes were at the time, but they didn't know why they happened.
Right.
And then you have to go across this land that's being torn apart by the earthquakes. You don't know what's going to be around the corner. Plus, the land and much of that area was still pretty swampy. You had cypress swamps and rivers and bayous to ford. That was a heck of a trip.
Yeah, and then some of the land had changed too, right? There were lakes where there hadn't been lakes. The land had dropped in certain areas. So even some of these markers you might have used is like, well, there's that third tree. We just keep going here. That third tree's gone. So very, very difficult for them to make that journey, and it would have been very unfamiliar to them as well. I'm just thankful that I've been fortunate enough to not have to face that situation.
Absolutely.
And I hope I don't. And remember, you would have had continual aftershocks and earthquakes, right? So there would have been rumblings. Really, there was a gentleman in Louisville, Kentucky, who counted almost 2,000 aftershocks. So really almost hourly. So you would have had the land shaking really almost continuously, which would have further undermined your confidence in what you're walking on.
Yeah.
So tough trip. Yeah, tough trip.
How do you think people tried to make sense of what was happening?
People knew that they were earthquakes, knew what earthquakes were. I think the first, it's really hard to tell. I think really the main thing they were trying to do at this point was kind of establish some order and figure out what we need to do to kind of keep going. And it was a lot of consternation. You had reports from after that first day that some folks were so fired up they couldn't sit down. Some folks were shocked into silence. So, I think it was really, you would think after like a hurricane or something like we dealt with down in Florida recently, I think it's going to be the same kind of feelings, right? What now? So, except you didn't have FEMA or SEMA or any of these agencies that are going to come there and help, so it was really, really would have been very different.
So you mentioned the comet that had been seen just before all this happened. Like, I think there were some people who saw that as some sort of divine warning, or like they blamed the comet and somehow for some reason for causing the earthquakes.
Right. Right. And then one thing that they talk about, and all the firsthand accounts talk about, is the earthquakes unleashed a smell. It was a sulfurous smell, right? And so We associate the smell of sulfur with hell, right? Some folks thought hell was being unleashed on Earth. And the smell, they think this was a very swampy area, so this was probably the release of gases and things that had been trapped in pockets under these swamps, and that could be a very overpowering smell. There's also reports of some lights and things of that nature, and you will hear reports of earthquake lights even today, but there's really no scientific backing. There's no confirmation of anything like that as well, but there would have been lights and smell and a fog, and so it would have been really, really, I think eerie is a good way to describe it.
Right.
Terrifying, another one, to be quite honest.
Absolutely.
With you, to not smell it. So.
And I guess like the experience too, like when an earthquake hits a place like California, there's a lot of bedrock around, which can kind of at least short circuit or interrupt those seismic waves. But in southern Missouri, that's alluvial, sand. This is sand and silt, I don't know how, like 20 feet deep or 100 feet deep or whatever it is. And when the earthquake hits, those waves of seismic waves just roll across the land. I imagine it just felt like you were standing on quicksand a lot of the time when a quake hit.
Absolutely. There was actually a report of a gentleman who, in New Madrid on that first day, after the first big quake, he went out to check on some other people after a few hours. And on his way back, the second shock hit. And he said it was very difficult for him to even get back to his house. The ground was moving so much. So I think those firsthand accounts really paint that a very good picture in that regard.
Yeah. All right. So we have this first round of quakes in December. The second round of major quakes is in February of 1812.
January 23rd, actually,
right.
There was another quake that was mid to high 7 magnitude. There is not a lot of information about that. It was very, very cold. The Ohio was iced over. So you didn't have people who were able to get down there. It was all we know is a woman named Eliza Bryan wrote a letter a couple years after the events talking about it and just saying that January event was almost as big as the first quake from December 16th. And then from that period until the last quake, February 7th, they said the ground was moving almost constantly. So this is a period of about 2 weeks where the ground is just going to be shifting and constantly moving. And what you had seen from the first round of quakes with the homes in the New Madrid area, chimneys were destroyed, but the homes typically were still standing, although people were afraid to live in them. They were still living outside. But the January quake did more damage, and then that February 7th quake, which is generally regarded as the largest, and also thought of as being having occurred as the closest to New Madrid. Its epicenter was the closest of any of the major quakes that hit. It basically flattened everything that was still standing in town. So February 7th was the real big one, and that's the one that was referred to even by locals at the time as the Big Shock. And that was the one that really, really kind of flattened the town. And then you'll hear people say that, it was a very bad flood year in 1812 too, because of course it was. So that just kind of did the rest in terms of finishing off what was left of New Madrid there in the spring of 1812.
Wow. So I wonder, do we have any idea how many people moved away in the immediate aftermath, like after the December quakes?
I don't know exactly. It was, I would say, the majority of them. A lot of folks just tried to leave as quickly as possible. Census records and information show the population had halved by 1820. And this is New Madrid County again, so not just immediate New Madrid area. Think of probably more like 15 or 20 counties down here in southeast Missouri that would have been what is now, or that would have been back then what was called New Madrid County. But it was a pretty quick and pretty quick decrease in population.
Right, because when you think about it again, like these quakes are so first of all you have the quakes and people are reluctant to go back to their homes, but it's also winter.
Right. Yes,
so
exactly.
If you don't go back to your home, I could see why people would just decide the heck with this. I'm just going somewhere
Yeah,
else.
going somewhere else. That's exactly right. Now, another series of earthquakes actually hit in 1812 in Caracas, Venezuela. That killed like 20,000 people, actually. The U.S. provided disaster relief for these folks in Caracas, Venezuela, to try and help them. And that led a lot of U.S. congressmen to say, hey, we had these big earthquakes here in Missouri, too. Why don't we help some Americans? And so in 1814, a measure was passed to provide disaster relief for those who had survived the New Madrid quakes in the form of land grants. Land grants were given in Missouri Territory near what would become Hannibal and also Kansas City. And of course, when you try to do something nice for people, it's going to be characterized by massive fraud. Yes. So you actually had lawsuits around New Madrid land grants for 3 decades. So someone tried to claim the hot springs in Missouri on a New Madrid land grant, in fact, or hot springs in Arkansas. I apologize. Hot springs in Arkansas within New Madrid land grant. So yes.
Wow.
Yes.
You said tried, so maybe that one didn't quite work out there.
Yeah. Well, it worked out for the land speculators, I think, because they would find people who'd been in New Madrid and they'd offer them 10 cents on the dollar for their land, right? And then they'd go and they'd get $60, $60 an acre worth of or whatever in terms of the land grant. So they would cash it in for a more profitable land grant. And the folks who had signed that away had no idea. So right. It was not a great disaster relief mechanism.
Well, so tell us a little bit about what we know the earthquakes did to the Mississippi.
Sure. So the Mississippi was immediately convulsed and was very, very difficult. You actually had waterfalls that were formed. One was upstream from New Madrid and one was downstream from New Madrid. These made it very, very difficult to pass. But the river being such a massive body of water with such a huge volume, these waterfalls actually began to erode pretty quickly. And within several weeks, a couple of months, they were navigable. You had islands that were formed. Islands disappeared. There was one island that was notorious. It was called the Crow's Nest. It was a pirate island. Actually, people don't know there were pirates on the Mississippi. And the Crow's Nest apparently was notorious and had been for decades as a place that you needed to avoid if you were navigating the Mississippi. Crow's Nest just disappeared. The pirate island just sunk. So the pirate problem was taken care of. But you had reports from folks who were trying to navigate the river shortly after the earthquakes. The riverbanks were the real problem. You had acres of land that were calving into the river. Trees were falling. It was made it very, very difficult to navigate for a period of time. But these heavy floods we talked about in 1812 cleared out a lot of that. So really by the end of the spring in 1812, the river was kind of back to business as usual, which is surprising and amazing, but also I think speaks to the power of the Mississippi River, which is a massive body of water. Yeah. And if you grow up by it, you just don't appreciate how big and how powerful that river really is.
Yeah.
So, especially down south of the Ohio, a lot of people aren't aware, but 60 to 70% of the water on the lower Mississippi comes from the Ohio and its tributaries as opposed to the upper Mississippi. So that's a little interesting tidbit that it always blows my mind. I'm from Iowa, so I'm prejudiced towards the upper Mississippi.
Yeah, that's all right. I lived in Wisconsin for quite a few years in La Crosse, so I have a special affection for the upper part of the river too. But the lower river is amazing in its own way too, and absolutely beautiful.
It's massive. It's just so much bigger.
Yeah.
There's only one bridge between us and New Madrid and Memphis, actually. So, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So at that time, then the main way of traveling on the river would have been on flatboats. So these were, boats that were propelled by oars, and mostly people were moving goods downriver. We know that there were some people on flatboats who kind of got caught on the river during the quakes, as I recall, right?
Yes. And we really don't know. And a lot of those folks would have perished. We just don't know how many. But the estimates you typically see are in the hundreds of people that would have perished on the river. Now, the first steamboat to ever launch on the Mississippi, called the New Orleans, had sailed from Pittsburgh in October, and it was actually just south of New Madrid on December 16th when the earthquakes hit. So the New Orleans actually experienced the earthquakes, but was able to continue its trip and was able to successfully get to New Orleans. So I think that speaks to the river at least being navigable. It was very difficult because all of their landmarks had changed, right? So new islands and things. So it was slow going, but I don't think that steamboat. I think that steamboat did about 3 miles an hour anyway. So wasn't going real fast.
Right. They weren't blazing speed down the river at that point.
No.
And I kind of remember one story about the New Orleans that I think it was the New Orleans. They had tied up to an island overnight. And when they got up the next morning after some more tremors, that island was gone.
Yes, I've heard that same story. So yes.
That would be a little unsettling.
That would be very unsettling to be the place. There's an island, good place, right. And then the island is gone.
So, people always talk about how the river ran backwards during this earthquake.
Yes.
Can you just say a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. So the seismic zone, the New Madrid seismic zone, is actually composed of 3 primary faults. One of them basically starts straight west of New Madrid, and it runs southeast into Tennessee. So it splits the river. That fault is what's known as a reverse fault. Reverse faults are characterized by uplift. So this was on the February 7th earthquake, the one we talked about. So the largest quake, high 7s, they think, resulted uplift from that earthquake. They think created kind of a tsunami within the river channel itself. So this would have really, not the only place you would have seen the river running backwards would have been if you were in New Madrid, Missouri. And that would have been somewhat disconcerting, right? If you get the uplift, shoves that water back, and the way the river's shaped here, we're actually at the top of a horseshoe-shaped bend. So when we look across the Mississippi River, we're looking straight south, which is unique. So the river actually runs past New Madrid by about 5 miles, turns and runs downstream north to New Madrid, is running straight west past us, and then turns south right past town. But where the river turns and heads north towards New Madrid, a crack developed as well, they think. And so you had some water that would have poured out of the river into this crack. And it ended up in a sunken area in Tennessee that is now Reelfoot Lake. Reelfoot Lake State Park. Very nice, worth a visit. Its birthday was February 7th, 1812. So the birth of Reelfoot, they think, sort of exacerbated the river running backwards phenomenon that we talk about. It's interesting. The first gentleman to write a report on the earthquakes, his name was Myron Fuller. He wrote this report in 1912, so a full century after the earthquakes. It was written for the United States Geological Survey. He thought the river running backwards was a case of mass hysteria. So he didn't think anything could make a river run backwards. But as geologists and seismologists study these faults and how they behave, they're like, we think something like that kind of happened. So there's your answer as far as did the river run backwards. I would say, yeah, sort of, mostly, depending on where you go.
Right, depending on what you mean by flows backwards, right? Like
yeah, exactly. Right. Like Lake Itasca in Minnesota did not overflow its banks, right?
Did not. St. Louis did not get flooded from the south.
Right, from water coming from the south. No.
All right, so it was a mess. So how long? So we had this second round of major quakes, late January into February. How long do we think the quakes continued to disrupt the area?
You had earthquakes. Really, there's anecdotal evidence that there would have been earthquakes really almost into the 1840s, to the point that occasional shaking basically was a visitor reported that they were having a meal in New Madrid, and there was some shaking, and a lady said, "Oh, honey, that's just an earthquake." So, pretty. You would have had earthquakes really for several decades, not daily or not massive ones, but aftershocks enough that the people just sort of kind of wrote them off as just an earthquake, right? You had the population of New Madrid County did not reach pre-earthquake levels until 1840, the 1840 census. So 1820, 1830, it was still about a third of its size in 1810. And remember, this is as people are moving west in mass too. So people would move to the area; they just wouldn't come to New Madrid because they heard of earthquakes, and then kind of so I guess maybe a little bad juju. But by 1840, the population would have been almost 4,500 in New Madrid County. And really, it was just folks kind of doing what they got to do to get this farmland usable again, to make sure that they're able to feed their families. And then you still have all the livestock and not livestock, but wild game, fish, things that you can use to eat. So, you had earthquakes really throughout that year. But I think people started moving into their homes again. It seemed like in the late spring, early summer of 1812, people started like, okay, I'm just going to go back inside.
Right. Those who were still around. I think it was
right.
I think it might have been John James Audubon passed by that area around 1819, 1820, somewhere in that range, and wrote about how abandoned everything seemed. That apparently at that time, still a lot of people had not moved back. In fact, even the Shawnee Indians who had lived nearby gave up and moved to western Missouri.
Right? Yes, they moved. Yes, they took that as a sign. And there's reports 1818, someone visiting New Madrid called it an insignificant hamlet of 20 log homes. So, it was not booming again. 1819, someone said it was that New Madrid displayed the most melancholy aspects of decay. So, it didn't bounce back immediately, and I don't think we should think of it that way. And even as late as 1846, there wasn't an inn in town for travelers.
Right.
And there had been a tavern, custom house that could have been used for travelers. That was actually operated by a gentleman, John Ordway, who was on the Lewis and Clark expedition. So he had settled in New Madrid, and earthquakes, I think, sort of did his family. And they went north up near Commerce, Missouri, I think.
All right. So what are some of the lingering scars on the land that the earthquakes left behind? Are there places, you mentioned Reelfoot Lake, are there places we can still see today how the earthquakes changed the land around there?
Around Reelfoot Lake is a real good place to see that. Down in Arkansas, there's a lake. It's called Big Lake. That was actually formed by the December 16th, 1811 earthquake. Sand blows or sand boils. We haven't talked about those. They are caused by a side effect of earthquakes that's known as liquefaction. Sand blows are very common in this area. Sand blows, just about every field around here. We're very heavily agricultural still to this day in New Madrid County. And I would say probably every field in the county is going to have a sand blow or a sand boil. And you will see some of those, some larger ones, kind of dispersed throughout the area. We've got Billy Goat Hill here in town. We call it Billy Goat Hill. It's a little rise in the land, and it is very flat here in New Madrid. But that uplift is from the 1811 and 12 earthquakes. The sand blows or sand boils were important to scientists. They become even more so. They really thought all of them came from the 1811 and 12 earthquakes, but as scientists started kind of rooting around in them, they found organic material they were able to date and realized that some of these were much, much older. So they gave evidence of earthquakes. There's good evidence of earthquakes prior to 1811 and 12 on the New Madrid seismic zone at about 1450, 900, and 300 AD. Some older ones as well, too. Wow. So the sand blows have been important to us for that reason.
Right. So I know that there's no way to know this with any high degree of accuracy, but what is our best guess about the number of people who died in the quakes?
I've seen numbers from about 300 to about 1,500, and there's just really no way for me to even. I've never really kind of focused on pinning that number down, just because there's just a real wide divergence in the estimates you see. So
Right.
yeah, I'm not 100% certain as far as that's concerned. Probably fewer than there would be today. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well, I live in St. Louis in a 1899 brick building. I think if we had an earthquake that hit of that magnitude now, I don't think my building would still be standing.
Not doing well.
No.
Not doing well. No, I'm in a brick structure here too at the museum, but they've got these little iron rods that run through the building. They're fastened to stars on the outside of them, and that's our earthquake protection. There's an iron rod that runs the length of the building, and it's screwed in with a star on the outside. There's 6 of them though.
Well,
So,
there.
hey,
You're set then, and so am I, because I've got my building has the same
feel
thing.
safe. I feel safe.
So
Hold on, everybody. Remember, in the event of an earthquake, drop, cover, and hold on. Get under a heavy table or desk and hold on till the shaking stops. There you go.
so how
Public service.
exactly? That's great advice. And it's something I need to remember. I can only remember one time since I've been in St. Louis since 1988. I only remember one time when I felt any tremors. It was enough of a shake, and I'm thinking it was 10 or 12 years ago. It was early in the morning. I was still in bed, and I definitely felt a little shaking of the ground, and then found out later that day that there had been a minor a tremor along the New Madrid Fault. Have you experienced much since you've been there?
Yeah. Now this is we moved. I haven't lived here. I'm not a native. Moved here 10 years ago. This is my wife's hometown. She wanted to move home. I wanted to stay married. So there's some other advice for you guys out there. Is do what your wife says. You'll be happier. I think it felt 5 since I've been here. There will be about 300 to 400 earthquakes per year that hit on the New Madrid seismic zone. I say in a typical year, about 10 will shake the surface, which could be 5, could be 25. 3 magnitudes, kind of the magic number that it takes to shake the surface, though. But the last one I personally felt would have been it's about 2 years ago, and it was a 2.9 actually. So I felt a high 2. It was right underneath town, and so it's been a little quiet in terms of the large, what we call big quakes around here. There's only been 3 magnitude earthquakes in the last 12 months. One was in Missouri, one was in Tennessee, and one was in Arkansas. So there you go. 5 states have faults in them from the New Madrid seismic zone, and 3 of them have had earthquakes.
Wow. So other than having an earthquake museum, like has the history, the earthquake history, how do people in New Madrid think much about this? Does it have much of an impact on lives today? Do people dismiss Ivan Browning?
Well, Ivan Browning was a boon for the museum. We sold a lot of T-shirts around his prediction in 1990. I got to be honest, I didn't know what a New Madrid was in 1990. I was an undergrad who was busy doing undergrad things other than studying. But really, I would say folks are aware, not overly concerned. We've got big old river that is probably more of a clear and present danger to our everyday existence in terms of flooding. So we are just people are aware, and then I would say folks in rural areas are probably a little more self-reliant than you would probably be in a metro area. So just in terms of the stuff we have around here, in terms of 4-wheelers and grain bins and things of that nature. So I would say if there were a big earthquake, we would like it, but we're probably as ready as anywhere.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
So tell us a little bit about the museum.
Sure. The Madrid Historical Museum, we were founded in 1975. We're pretty small. We're about 4,000 square feet or so. We focus on earthquakes primarily, but we've got a very nice collection of Mississippian artifacts. The mound builders or the folks who built Cahokia mounds. Our other large exhibit is on the Civil War. There was some very heavy fighting during the Civil War, 1862, around New Madrid. So it was a critical win for the Union. And those are our 3 main exhibits. And then I would say the rest of our Our exhibits are what you would find in kind of a small town museum, right? We've got a nice antique collection. We focus on agriculture. There's a nice display on the history of agriculture in New Madrid. And we are open every day. We're open about 357 days a year. Closed around Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, and then Easter Sunday. You'll typically find us here other than that. 9 to 5 Monday to Saturday, noon to 5 on Sundays. December through March, we shorten those hours a little bit. It's 10 to 4 and noon to 4. So, but otherwise, we'd love to see you. We do have a small admission fee. It's 5 for adults and 3 for students. And I have a group rate for groups of 10 or more. We'd like you to book in advance.
Awesome. So other than visiting the museum in person, do you have any social media presence at all where people can keep up? Or
we have a Facebook page. Sure, we're New Madrid Historical Museum is our on Facebook. You can follow us there. But that's really all we're doing in terms of social media right now.
All right.
But you can always we have a website. It's newmadridmuseum.com, which has some pictures of our exhibits, some information about the museum as well too. So
awesome. Any favorite books about the earthquakes that you would recommend?
I would actually. The one I typically refer to, the one I referred to yesterday preparing for this podcast, it's called The New Madrid Earthquakes. It's by a gentleman named James Lau Penick, Penick, published late 70s, I believe. There's another good one that I will typically refer to. It is the earthquake that the earthquake America forgot. I had to look back on my bookshelf there. That is by a gentleman named David Stewart, and it is very, very thorough. It is a thick book. You can reach out to us via our webpage, and we can ship those to you if you want.
Awesome. Jeff, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and the stories.
Absolutely. Happy to do it, Dean. Thank you for including me. We like talking about earthquakes here, so it's been a lot of fun.
All right. Well, we'll have a great day then.
You do the same, sir. Thank you very much.
If you're enjoying the show, share that love with other people. Leave a review on iTunes or your preferred podcast app. Each review makes a difference and helps other fans of the Mississippi River and the Midwest find this show. And now it's time for the Mississippi Minute. The discussion I just had with Jeff Grunwald about the earthquakes around New Madrid reminded me of another story from that part of the river. As Jeff mentioned, New Madrid sits along one of the Mississippi's big meanders, the New Madrid Bend, or the Kentucky Bend if you live on the river's east bank. That meander and the human desire to draw boundaries created a geographic oddity that we're still living with today. In the 19th century, as surveyors worked their way west to draw lines separating Tennessee and Kentucky, they were trying to follow a straight line along 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude. This seemed like a pretty straightforward task, but they messed up when they reached the Tennessee River, so the boundary between the states jumps north about 17 miles of the intended line, all the way to Virginia. Not content to make just one mistake, the surveyors failed to notice that their line cut across a Mississippi River meander and isolated 17.5 square miles, roughly 11,000 acres, that ended up getting assigned to Kentucky, even though it had no land connection to Kentucky at all. Tennessee and Kentucky fought over this outpost for decades. Until 1948, Tennessee insisted it was part of its Obion County. The dispute was eventually resolved in Kentucky's favor, which meant that this little Kentucky outpost would find a home in Fulton County. Geographers call this type of geographic anomaly an exclave, where part of a territory is completely isolated from the rest of that territory. While geographers have a term for the area, settling on a common name has been tougher. It's been variously called Madrid Bend, Kentucky Bend, and Bessie Bend, after nearby Bessie, Tennessee. The Killjoys at the U.S. Census Department call it West Census County Division. The fun people, though, call it Bubbleland. Bubblelanders were, and still are, mostly farmers. At first, most people grew corn and wheat, but cotton became the dominant crop before the Civil War. Just about every farm that was next to the river had a landing for steamboats, and many of them also had wood yards where they sold wood to refuel steamboats. Places like Watson's Landing, Harris's Landing, Compromise, Nolan's Landing, Kentucky Point, Kerrigan's Flat, Adams Landing, Moss Landing, State Line Landing. There were a whole bunch of them. The narrowest point in the bend is just a half-mile wide, so at one time a steamboat passenger could disembark at the state line on one side of the bend, get a night's sleep, then board the same steamer when it came around the other side and continue their trip. The population in Bubbleland probably peaked in the late 19th century at just over 300 people, many of whom grew cotton as sharecroppers. In Life on the Mississippi, Mark Twain described a colorful feud between the Darnell and Watson families. He wrote, "Both families belonged to the same church. They lived each side of the line, and the church was at a landing called Compromise. Half the church and half the aisle was in Kentucky, the other half in Tennessee." Changes in agriculture and repeated flooding would eventually take a toll on Bubbleland. In 1937, a levee break flooded the peninsula and left behind blue holes and piles of sand. The area also flooded again in 1912, 1950, 73, 78, and 83. You get the point. They had a lot of flooding. The dozen or so remaining residents of Bubbleland might be more isolated today, though, than they were in the 19th century. New Madrid, Missouri is the closest city, but you need a boat to get there, and ferry service ended long ago. The only land route into the area is via Tennessee State Road 22. Bubblelanders get their mail through Tiptonville, Tennessee. Cotton has been replaced by corn and soybeans. The nearest grocery store and healthcare facilities are 12 miles away in Tiptonville. To vote, residents have to drive 40 miles to Hickman, Kentucky, passing through Tennessee before re-entering Kentucky, and their children go to school in Lake County, Tennessee. Bubbleland today is a handful of houses, a cemetery, and a few thousand acres of cultivated land surrounded by tall levees meant to keep that pesky Mississippi River from flooding it again. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to the series on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss out on future episodes. I offer the podcast for free, but when you support the show with a few bucks through Patreon, you help keep the program going. Just go to patreon.com/Dean Klinkenberg. If you want to know more about the Mississippi River, check out my books. I write the Mississippi Valley Traveler guidebooks for people who want to get to know the Mississippi better. I also write the Frank Dodge Mystery Series that's set in places along the river. Find them wherever books are sold. The Mississippi Valley Traveler podcast is written and produced by me, Dean Klinkenberg. Original music by No Offense. See you next time.